All right. So moving on to our next story. This one comes from a CSO online, and the title here is 24% of vulnerabilities are abused before a patch is issued. Dum dum dum. So we've talked about this a couple of times now. There was a report from using the CISA data. Probably 2 or 3 shows ago that we talked about similar kinds of results. In 2024, there were 768 CVEs that were reported as being exploited in the wild, which is about 20% above what we saw last year. And of those, about 24% were being exploited before a patch was actually released. And as I said, on one of the segments earlier, it's hard to do anything, proactively to prevent the 0 day the 0 day issue. The best you can do, in my view, is mitigate it. So, like as an example, we're seeing a lot of these in my experience. We're seeing a lot of these being applied to things that shouldn't be exposed to the internet, like web
Right.
firewall control panels and other device control panels, which historically haven't had the level of security and development lifecycle stuff applied to it that should have been. So that's outside of that. I think we're back to having to um, have plans in place to detect the exploitation, right, or the impacts that happen after exploitation. So like post exploitation activities, it really comes down to being able to detect, well, what if somebody does hack your firewall? How would you detect that, and how would you respond to that, and so on?
If only we had a firewall for our firewalls.
I think we're gonna partner with a vendor who offers something like that, right?
That's
That's
intriguing.
what I've heard. Yeah.
A little tease for the audience.
Let's see. So what other points did I want to bring up on this crazy article here? Um, just kind of skimming through. There was something else I wanted to. Oh,
Well, what, yeah.
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, I think that this also is another argument for patching rapidly. But it's interesting when you look at the total number of CVEs at release and how many are actually actively exploited. It's such a tiny percentage. And in hindsight, if we knew what that percentage was, our vulnerability management job would be easy. The problem is we don't know, right? So there's this argument of, well, look, only such a small percentage of these are exploited, and look how many active attacks start with phishing and not vulnerability exploitation against software. Why am I spending all this time and energy on patch management? There's a lot of things that go into that. If we didn't spend so much time on patch management, maybe the amount of vulnerabilities that were exploited would go up dramatically. Maybe it's because we're doing such a relatively decent job with patch management that phishing is such an easier or such a higher prevalent technique because that's the way in. That's harder to solve. The other thing is, I think attack surface awareness is really important. And to
Mm-hmm.
your point, like what's exposed to the internet should be your top priority, regardless of what it is, or consider it, like you were saying, from a lateral movement standpoint, or a what's my post exploit activity once I breach something on the barrier. I think it can be somewhat dangerous to say, well, this vulnerability is deep inside my environment, so it's not that big a deal, or this vulnerability is just a privilege escalation that have to get on the device itself first. Well, those things can happen. So it's a really hard problem to know what to patch, and if you've got limited cycles, it can be very difficult to know where to spend your time. But for God's sake, do the perimeter first.
Yeah, absolutely. I really think the average organization should have, a way to prioritize what they're patching. And I know that we all make the joke about, how the crunchy hard exterior and the soft, gooey interior. But the reality is, aside from having your control panels exposed to the internet, you don't have the entire freaking internet scanning and trying to exploit things on the internal of your network. And so I'm not saying that those things aren't important to patch and patch fast. I'm saying that it's perhaps less important to patch them as fast as the things that are on the edge of your network where people can find them programmatically using tools like Shodan. That's the point. And there were a couple of other interesting data points in here, which I found interesting. They said that around half of vulnerabilities are first exploited within 192 days, which I guess doesn't necessarily. And then, by the
192
way,
days
the
of what?
192 days of patching of a patch being
Okay,
released.
gotcha. So patch comes out over half.
Over half of the ones that will be exploited. Again, not every
Okay,
vulnerability. Only a subset of vulnerabilities will ever be exploited. But of the ones that will, half are exploited within 192 days. But
so the bad actors are watching for patches to come out and figuring out what to go after.
right. The thing
Okay,
that surprised me was that after 1,000 days, so 3 years, only 75% of vulnerabilities that will be exploited have been exploited, which means that 25% of exploited vulnerabilities are only exploited after they've been out and known about and patched for over 3 years.
wow, what's going on there?
People aren't freaking patching
But also, the bad actors are finding it worth going after stuff that old.
because it's working since people aren't patching.
Maybe there's just some retro threat actors.
The retro computing movement has its
Yeah,
own malicious element. Yes,
yeah, they just like the classics. They're still working on some Windows 95 stuff.
that's got to be it. Oh goodness. So, what one of the things that this tells me is, look, 0 days are a problem. Don't debate that at
Wow,
all.
breaking news.
But but there's a huge amount of the problem space that can be solved by patching what you can.
But we suck at it, so
But we but we do suck at it.
it's hard.
Yeah, it's one. So, we don't have we don't have the article talking about it now, but in the past we've talked about other reports that have indicated a lot of successful attacks are against devices that aren't. I may say this incorrectly, but aren't known to the organization. They're not under active management, and so which is again kind of comes back to an inventory control issue, right? You can't patch necessarily what you don't know exists in your environment. And so a lot
Right.
of, I guess what I'm saying is just the fundamentals matter, right? We all want to consternate over like the really hard problem. How do we solve for 0 days and whatnot? But I think we should take a step back and say, like, how do we make sure we understand everything that's in our environment? And how do we make sure that we understand when there's a vulnerability that applies to them? And then how do we make sure that we get those vulnerabilities fixed in a timely manner or otherwise mitigated? I'm not going to,
Yeah.
dispute that there's cases where you can't, but look, not all problems require like a super sophisticated AI enabled blockchain in the cloud kind of service. Some things have solutions that just requires some work to enable. And I know patching sucks. We've talked about this also in the past a lot too. Like patching is about the most unsexy thing you can do in the security world,
It's
other
a good
than
thing you
power
caveated.
other than other than PowerPoints.
Because I had some lists of some other unsexy things I was going to mention, but
I
you threw it in the security world, so you just
Well,
cut
that's
me
why
off.
I saw where you were going, and so I had to just cut
But it's
that off.
important. All jokes aside, patching really like it matters. And I know others will argue it doesn't. But and the other thing I would say is we're entering a world where we can automate a lot of this patching. And that has its own risks. I get it. But I think the upsides are there. And we should be exploring those options as much as we can.
And I think honestly, I think we would, but I think we would do well to focus on patching in as much of an automated fashion as we can and applying the smart thinking on how to mitigate the problems that come along with automated patching.
But CrowdStrike outage, that's a black swan event, guys.
Yeah. And it may never happen again, right? That was a bad thing for sure.
How much production risk versus security risk do you balance, right? And if automatic patching really does save your bacon in ways that are tough to articulate, tough to quantify. Here's the problem we always run into is how many attacks did you stop due to a successful patch? Don't know. Very, very difficult to quantify.
Yeah. Yep. How many planes didn't fall out of the sky because of the TSA? It's difficult.
Well, I think we know that answer. Zero.
But it's a hard problem to quantify. That's the point.
Sorry, I'm just being snarky about the TSA. They're fine people. I'm sorry. I take it back. Edit that out.
It's
But how
it's
many terrorists have been arrested by the TSA?
I don't know. But how many terrorists don't go?
Zero.
How many terrorists don't try because of the TSA? That's the
All
hard.
right.
That's the hard part with quantifying some of these things. And look, I'm not a fanboy of the TSA by any stretch. I think it's security theater. But the point is back to what you were saying. It's difficult to demonstrate, like, if you were to implement such a process and somebody comes along and says, well, that's a big pain in the ass. We think we could save a bunch of money if we stopped doing that, or the first time you have an adverse consequence from a patch being deployed automatically, there's of course going to be calls to stop doing that, and you'll be in a position of having to justify why you do it, and so you'll really be called to the carpet to show, like, what was the business value? How many times did you stop a problem by having this automated patching? And that could be really hard to answer.
I think it goes back to our first story, which is learning from other people's mistakes and trying to apply best practices, learn from other industry outages and issues. And I think that's your best defense of saying, look, here are the stats, here are the statistics, here's what I'm defending against. This is why I'm doing it. And this is what the industry best practices teach us. The problem is you're typically trying to justify that to somebody who's not necessarily a security person.
But again, I come back to, I think we ought to be trying to find ways of mitigating the problems that come along with that automated patching, rather than trying to come up with ways of handling not patching automatically. Right. So whether that's, test pipelines, or, whatever, you can imagine all sorts of complicated scenarios. But the net point is, that's where I think the big thinking needs to happen, is figuring out how we mitigate the downsides of that automated patching, rather than, again, trying to find some other hokey cat or mousetrap type solution, which is just gonna fail.
I will say, if you are called to the carpet to explain why your auto patch caused an outage, what makes it go a little smoother is bringing a bottle of Defensive Security's handcrafted bathtub whiskey. It just helps the conversation.
Or special blend of fruit juices and punch. Gonna be great.